Thank you for the introduction, Jeff. I'll do my best to give some information that could hopefully be helpful in the Blackbird issue. Just to let you know, before I start, I am a wildlife biologist with the USDA Wildlife Services National Wildlife Research Center. I am located on NDSU campus in the biology department. And most of the research on blackbirds is done in collaboration with the NDSU, especially graduate students. So, I mean, as Jeff said, I'm sure if you have grown sunflower or familiar with sunflower in the Dakotas, you're familiar with blackbirds and the resulting frustrations that they cause. There's not one quick, easy solution for mitigating bird damage, but by integrating multiple tools, deploying the tools before the birds arrive, and by using mobile dynamic frightening devices, hopefully some combination of the tools will begin to help. And also want to just mention before it goes without saying that in this scenario, following all local, regional, and federal laws, ordinances, for example, in how to apply pesticides, how to consider lethal take of native bird species, sound ordinances, use of drones as hazing tools, etc. So when thinking about blackbirds, understanding scale is important for the ability to effectively reduce damage, as well as the ease of implementing a method or tool. So when we're talking about the continental or the regional scales, this is where we understand how the diversity and distribution of crops on broad scales, along with the seasonal population dynamics of the migratory birds and how they're responding to the landscape. At the regional scale is where you, the ability of a farmer or a wildlife manager to have an impact on bird populations is very minimal. But by studying these birds during fall roosting and migration, we can understand their movements and their distribution. And then that can help us with the timing of peak numbers, of knowing when we want to get the crop off the field, or inform tool deployment or ideal timing of harvest, so to avoid those large aggregations. So in starting with some of the regional thoughts or looking at how birds are moving across the landscape, what I have on this slide are two different ways that we can visualize bird abundances and distribution across the continent, and then more specifically in particular areas of North Dakota. So here, this is an online resource and from eBird that basically is showing over the year the weekly abundances of red-winged blackbirds in this case over time. So if I start the animation over again, you know, the higher abundances in purple are in the southern overwintering areas. They spread out during their breeding. At the end of breeding, they aggregate and then they move back south. So you can see when the numbers of birds in those large flocks are going to be greatest in North Dakota. I do also have here a link to a site called Birdcast Info, and they do real-time looking at, you know, when the weather is appropriate and there's going to be alerts for when migration is happening. You can look at your particular county and look to see what the potential abundances of blackbirds are in any particular week. Maybe a resource to be able to just understand a little bit better about when you should expect peak numbers, so to get your crop off early. That's all based on citizens reporting bird numbers to something called eBird. So it's not perfect, and some of the more remote counties don't have as many people reporting, but overall it tends to come out in the wash. Also here on the right, we did a study where we wanted to look at the peak numbers of birds specifically in North Dakota near the McKenzie Slough. We used weather radar out of Bismarck to pick up what we call biological scatter. So this up here is a radar image with biological scatter. We know the size of a blackbird. So birds are showing up on radar so we can estimate numbers. So using that, we have an example of a year. So this is 2015. We looked at year across the bottom, and the green is basically the percentage of sunflower fields in North Dakota that are becoming mature. And then the decline is as those mature sunflower fields are harvested. The blue squiggles are actually the damage in US dollars, but that's based on bioenergetics of how many birds we got off of biological scatter. So in this particular year, we did see that they started to peak in October. And so any ability to get your crop off the field before early or mid-October is, of course, highly encouraged. It varies by year. There are some years where they peak early in August and stay high, and those are difficult years for damage. But on average, it's mostly peaking in October. All right, so and then if we move to the landscape scale, this is where we can start to have management methods where we can impact bird distribution through habitat modification, which is going to influence where the birds are roosting, and also where how they're making foraging decisions. So this level, we have more tools at our disposal, but they also require a fair amount of planning and coordination with neighbors. Because you can't implement some methods beyond your property. For example, cattail management is important, but the idea of being able to reduce standing cattails so that you reduce the number of birds and spread the birds across the landscape is difficult because you're having to work with neighbors for that management. If you're at the field scale or landscape scale, also suggested that you plant large fields, potentially coordinate with your neighbors so that you have more acres in a given area to dilute the bird pressure across the landscape. And also, you could also potentially, at this scale, plant some decoy crops closer to known roosting locations. The methods at the field that are more common and where farmers have more control include farm management. That includes like selecting a variety that's early maturing, planting early, trying to get to harvest early by desiccating the crop, those kind of farm management tools. Also, there are visual and auditory deterrents, as well as potential registered avian chemical repellents. So as a sunflower farmer or somebody in sunflower, I assume that many have opinions about the efficacy of the tools that I've already mentioned or the tools that I'm going to be talking about. And we were also interested in the farmer insights. So we did send out a survey, I think 2020, a couple of years ago, and basically got responses from about 1,000 individuals. We looked at their opinions about the different tools that we listed and how often they use those tools. So if you look here at this graph, the green bluish color are those responses that think a particular tool is effective or moderately effective. Gray means they had no opinion. And then the brown to dark brown is slightly effective or not at all effective. What you can see is that cattail management, about 65% of the respondents thought it was effective. But if you look at how many are using that, it's lower. It's about 21%. Probably a little bit about the control of cattails, the accessibility to cattails, but also the cost, and that there's not a great way to reduce cattails that has staying power. What we do see is that that respondents were reporting less efficacy for tools that are often used, like lethal shooting or propane cannons, and reporting more use. Those don't require as much planning. They're distributed by wildlife services, and they're easily available. Unmanned aircraft systems or drones have more of a no opinion, around 58%, probably because it's a novel tool that hasn't been used as much. So for the rest of the talk and for what most of my research program involves is looking at some of these tools and methods. I'm mostly going to be focusing on our research and our work for using drones as hazing tools. But before I launch into that, I do want to just touch briefly on a study that we did for effective area of propane cannons, because this is a very commonly used tool. So we studied effective area by putting both red-winged blackbirds and brown-headed cowbirds into cages, covered them with a sheet, and then blast the cannon at different distances to see at which point they were relaxed, when they were vigilant, and when they startled. And we blasted. We also then had random distances at which we blasted the propane cannon and looked at those same behaviors. And we blasted the cannon 4 times in a row. For red-winged blackbirds, we found that they startled within 150 meters, and the probability of startling was greater within 150 meters, and they didn't respond with startling on those consecutive blasts. Brown-headed cowbirds, they startled out to 330 meters, and they still startled on those consecutive blasts. So the take-home message from that is that if you're concerned about the red-winged blackbirds, you're probably going to want to have a cannon at least every 300 meters, if not just in those cattail slough areas. Also, when you're setting up or wanting to have randomness in your blasts, having consecutive blasts that are within 30 seconds to a minute of each other are not probably increasing the threat, but you want to randomize it and have larger distances or interstimulus distance between those blasts. All right, so on to the meat of what I'm going to be talking about, and that's mostly drones. I will be talking about all of the research studies that we've done to try to establish best practices for hazing blackbird flocks with drones. With all of these different potential characteristics of either the drone, the landscape, or how you fly that drone. And our markers of success are usually whether the flock abandoned, or if there was a behavioral response, if we were able to reduce bird number, or if we altered bird behavior. Okay, so the first study we looked at was understanding shape and approach. So this was done early on individual blackbirds in an aviary. And so we wanted to see if they alerted sooner to particular shaped drones. They did alert much sooner to a drone that had a silhouette of a raptor, and then next to a fixed wing and then a multi-rotor, they alert to last. We also looked at birds alarm calling. They alarm called much more frequently to the raptor, and also when that flight was directly at the birds and not overhead. We looked at birds that tried to escape or took flight. They took flight in response to the raptor and the fixed wing. We did not have any birds that took flight in response to the multi-rotor when we're just looking at individual birds. Latency to return, they also took longer to return when it was a raptor shape. So ideally, the management recommendation would be to use a raptor silhouette shape. The raptor silhouette shaped drones aren't as common. They're harder to operate and also often limited in battery power. So the benefits of using something like a multi-rotor is maneuverability and being able to really chase flocks and to be aggressive in those maneuvers. Oh, also, and not just with individual birds, but we did also take these 3 platforms out into the field, and we did see that flocks responded faster to the raptor shapes, but field and flock size were predicting and impacting whether those flocks abandoned a field. And so the larger flocks were less likely to be impacted when we did 2 minutes of hazing with these platforms. All right, so next in that study, we did realize that, the landscape, the flock size, the environment was important, and that we also needed to have more of a negative stimulus to be able to have a greater impact on the large flocks. So we started a process of evaluating a spraying drone to spray an avian repellent. The avian repellent that we sprayed was methylene. But the first study we wanted to look at how the landscape, the environment influenced how close we could get the drone to the birds that were actively foraging. And so we did some similar evaluations with flight initiation distance. How close were we able to get? With the idea that those that had bigger distances would be considered, would be considered riskier. Okay, and so what we found is that when we hazed with this large spraying drone is that flight initiation distance declined later in the day. We were able to get closer to flocks later in the day, and we were able to get close to small flocks. Opposite of that, when we considered abandonment, Later in the day, we were able to increase abandonment, but we were able to increase abandonment even though we were able to get closer to them. They were riskier, but we were able to increase abandonment, probably most likely because the birds had already completed eating. They were satiated for the day and ready to go back to they're more willing to leave a crop and go back to their night roosts. So after we kind of established a protocol for being able to understand spraying, we then conducted a study where we actually did spray the avian repellent, and we compared that to a control when we were spraying water. This was also done during the 10 minutes of hazing. So we were applying the repellent to sunflower as we were going through and hazing blackbird flocks. So we didn't see that spraying a repellent increased abandonment or increased the decline in birds, but we did see that there was a change in behavior, that flocks exposed to methylphenolate took 33% longer to return. They might have hunkered down, and they also had more of an impact on how many times they lifted off the crop. So in addition, we were curious about the size and speed. We did see that the larger drone had some more efficacy in hazing than smaller drones. And so we wanted to know a little bit more about size and speed. We looked at the individual blackbirds' response to drones that were approaching, 3 different size drones approaching at different speeds. We see that the birds did respond sooner to the larger drone, which is the aggregate, and let the smaller drone approach closer. When you considered speed, there were significant interactions, and really the medium and the small drones, they were just, speed didn't as much matter. It was after that drone was 50 meters away, on average, birds took flight. The aggregate does look like they appear to find the slower moving large drone as more risky, but it's probably just that there was more exposure time and they had to monitor it longer. And so then, were able to locate it further away. And so they had more time to make that decision to leave. Also, most of our hazing was 2 minutes or 10 minutes. We really wanted to see if extending hazing time influenced efficacy, or how much time we really need to be effective. Also, while considering landscape and the environment. So on this study, we hazed for 75 minutes. We found that about full abandonment occurred 45% of the flocks, 74% returned. The time it took to abandonment was about 17 minutes, and latency to return to the field of those flocks was 9 minutes. If you look at the minutes hazed over the 75 minutes, the probability of abandoning the field increased over the time, but the rate was highest within that first 10 minutes of hazing. Also, if you look at average percent decline over the 75 minutes, you get the most of the decline in the first 10 minutes, and then it takes about 30 to 50 minutes to decrease the flocks by 50%. So if you're going to be having a drone hazing session, at least 10 minutes. If you want to reduce the flock by 50%, maybe up to 50 minutes. Also, the last study that we looked at was the adding a sound to a drone. We were just broadcasting that sound from stationary drones at this time to see what sound was considered the most threatening. So we used multiple sounds. We used distress calls from a red-winged blackbird and a yellow-headed blackbird. We used a recording of a firecracker, recording of a merlin call or a predator call, recording of a pyro screamer. And then for our controls or our checks, we had the recording of a robin and then just the rotor of the drone. What you see here is that the birds are taking flight in response to a firecracker. There's the highest probability of that. Almost 100% of those flocks took flight with firecrackers. And then less, but it was still somewhat effective. The distress calls, the Merlin calls, and the pyro, and they were all more effective than what we considered our controls. So adding sound to a drone during hazing will likely increase the riskiness or how risky that landscape is. All right, just a quick overview. We have used frightening sounds, especially firecrackers. Raptor shapes are scarier, but multi-rotors are easier to maneuver. We will be trying a multi-rotor with a Raptor silhouette to be able to get the best of both worlds. Also size, large drones are more noticeable and louder, but they're also harder to maneuver. Longer hazing duration improves decline, but you have to haze for at least 10 minutes. Faster drones are not inherently scarier, but are better able to chase across large distances. Directly approaching flocks, low to the crop, and chasing is required. You can't do a lawnmower type movement. Hazing is more successful if you have smaller fields and smaller flocks. And hazing flocks earlier in the day is recommended because that's when the feeding areas are being established. Also, integrating the avian repellent did not increase efficacy over just the 10 minutes. Either there needs to be more hazing or potentially more avian repellent applied or at a higher concentration. We do want to, our next study being to increase the negative stimulus by having multiple drones that have different negative stimuli, having a drone with sound, having a drone that's shaped like a raptor, and having a large looming drone. Also, we in the future would like to repeat the same fields over multiple days to see how long drones could, or if they could keep birds at lower numbers. So most of the focus on drones, but we also just have a list of other suggested management in addition to what I presented. You know, trying as best you can to avoid planting near roosts. But if you do plant near roosts, having, you know, early maturing varieties that you can get off earlier. Manage roosting habitat as much as you can, that being the cattail. You could plant decoy crops or to provide alternative forage. You can deploy any frightening devices and trying to do that early before they establish feeding areas. Try integrating multiple tools, coordinate planting and harvest with your neighbors so that you're not the first or the last field. Advance harvest by planting early maturing varieties and applying desiccants. Delay disking because the birds will continue to eat the waste seed. And then also trying not to make it attractive in other ways by having weed seeds or insects. And thank you so much for the invitation to present and for listening. And I guess I will wait until the break for questions.